the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. It's difficult to know even where to start, but let's start with Prigozhin, with Wagner. He's dead, isn't he? It's not some kind of ruse. Who killed him?
Well, first of all, the Russian government has investigated the remains that have been recovered at the crash site of the business jet that went down near the western Russian city of Tver, and they've confirmed that Prigozhin was on that airplane and he is dead. The list of people who would like to see Prigozhin dead is long. And the one man that could guarantee his protection, Vladimir Putin, for a number of reasons, wasn't going to guarantee his protection anymore. I mean, we need to remember that Prigozhin launched an armed insurrection against Vladimir Putin, his Minister of Defense, his Chief of the General Staff, on June 23, 24. This wasn't a game. 8,000 heavily armed men charged up the M4 highway, seizing control of two Russian cities before being halted outside of Moscow by thousands of Russian troops who were prepared to kill them. Prigozhin himself was put under risk by thousands of Chechen special forces that had surrounded him in Rostov-on-Don. If Prigozhin hadn't backed down and withdrawn, he and thousands of Wagner fighters would be dead today. But Russia would also have had the ignominy of going through a civil war, which is why Vladimir Putin cut the deal he did to prevent a civil war from breaking out on Russian soil. But he rightly called what Prigozhin did treason and labeled Prigozhin a traitor. And then Prigozhin, who was given an opportunity to be exiled in Belarus, continued to violate the terms of his parole. Putin had a meeting with Prigozhin and 35 of the top Wagner leaders on June 29th, at which time he recommended to Wagner that they terminate Prigozhin as their chief. Putin named somebody that he felt would be a more appropriate chief because Wagner, doing the business that it was doing, especially in Africa, could not be led by Prigozhin, a traitor to the Russian people. Prigozhin vetoed this. Dmitry Utkin, the senior military commander of Wagner, also vetoed it. And the Wagner commanders, many of whom wanted to go along with Putin, they're loyal to the brand, and they did this. Then Prigozhin turned around and continued to violate his parole, seeking ties with Africa even after the Russian government had said they're taking over the Africa operations of Wagner. So in theory, the finger points straight at Putin. But to accept that, you have to accept that Putin is a thug, that Putin is a godfather, that Putin lords over a mafia organization, and forget that he is the democratically elected chief executive of a modern nation state founded on the principle of the rule of law. Vladimir Putin did not order Prigozhin killed. We don't even know if anybody actually assassinated him. 4 of the Wagner members on the aircraft were a personal protection detail who loaded arms, ammunition, and pyrotechnics onto that airplane. There could have been an accident. We simply don't know. But what I can say with virtual absolute certainty is that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, had nothing to do with this.
He fell from the tallest window, it would appear. And people do in Russia, like they do in the United States and Britain. Inconvenient enemies of the state meet unfortunate ends in many countries, including yours, including mine. It would not surprise me if Putin had him killed for all the reasons you adumbrated. But there are many foreign interests who would have an interest in killing Prigozhin also, starting with the French, over Niger and many other things. What do you think of the possibility? It's scarcely, by the way, flattering to Russia if a foreign state were able to blow up an aircraft that took off from Moscow bound for St. Petersburg. That would be a whole different set of embarrassment. But there is the possibility that a foreign intelligence service was able to reach Prigozhin, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like I said, the only thing I'm discounting is that Vladimir Putin ordered this hit. I'll just, before I get to the foreign intelligence, I'll make one more thing. People forget that at the time Prigozhin's plane came down, Russia was celebrating one of the great diplomatic victories of all time. And that is, of course, what was taking place at the BRICS summit in South Africa, the enlargement of BRICS by 6 nations, the bringing together of a economic organization that could challenge the G7, challenge the singularity of American hegemony in the world, the beginning of what they would hope to be a multipolar, era of cooperation. Russia is going to take over BRICS in January of 2024 and will be the head of BRICS when this expansion takes place. This is what Putin wanted people to be talking about. So it just seems absurd that he would suck the air out of the story by timing the death of somebody he could kill at any time he wanted. Why do it over to there? Why do it at this time? Why do it in a way that the whole world's going to be pointing the finger at him? So that's why. Now, here's the only thing I have against foreign intelligence services doing it in the manner that Prigozhin came down. That is literally an act of war. I mean, if you want to commit nuclear suicide, if France really wants to do that, then assassinate somebody of the profile of Prigozhin in Russia. It's an act of war. The French intelligence, as they've shown in many of their previous past escapades, the murder of Greenpeace activists off the coast of New Zealand, aren't that good. People find out who did it, how they did it, what they did it, etc. I just don't see Macron being suicidal, just like I don't see the CIA being suicidal or MI6 being suicidal. It is an act of war against the nuclear-armed nation that already has high level of tensions against the 3. If France wanted Prigozhin dead, they could have killed him in Africa. That's where Prigozhin was most vulnerable. That's where an event like this should have taken place. The fact that it was done in Russia means that if Prigozhin was taken out by non-natural occurrences, an accident or something of that nature, I think the finger more likely goes to Russian oligarchs, Russian businessmen of a shadowy character. Prigozhin was a billionaire who ran a multi-billion-dollar company that was unraveling as he spoke. The Russians had taken over his front companies, his shadow companies. They had taken over the business of Wagner. Prigozhin owed billions of dollars. People lost billions of dollars. And when you're dealing with that kind of money, the revenge factor becomes quite hard and high. And as you said, people tend to fall out of buildings in Russia. And they aren't always pushed out by government hands. Many times they die from non-government hands because of the retained corruption that still exists in Russia today from the era of the oligarchs.
Yes, moving to the war. Larry Johnson, a former intelligence officer and Pentagon man, he said today, I know I put this to you before and you don't agree with me, but I'm going to keep putting it to you until the point that you might, because as the facts change, so do your opinions. He said today, Larry Johnson said today, that he felt there was a military coup coming Zelensky's way. Do you still set your hat against that?
As things deteriorate, as you have rightly pointed out, as facts change, then you have to go back and re-examine the data. As the Ukrainian army runs out of options, they are literally committing their strategic reserves to this final battle, this battle of exploitation to achieve the victory that they want, and they're not going to get it. And when this counteroffensive finally runs its course and the reality of what happened sinks in, as Russia commits 250,000 reserves that they have yet to commit, and they begin to push the Ukrainians back dramatically, you could very well have a 1917 moment. Again, bringing up the specter of Russian history, where Russian troops just quit the front line, pivoted, and marched against the Kerensky government in an effort to bring about peace. I still believe that the West does not want that outcome, and that the officers in the Ukrainian military don't want that, and even Russia doesn't want that, because you don't know who you're going to get to replace Zelensky. Right now, Zelensky is a known quantity that allows all sides to make calculations about how the future is going to unfold. If a coup is perpetrated, it creates many unknowns, but the soldiers don't give a damn, excuse my language, about the political maneuverings of Russia, the Zelensky government, the West. They care about their lives. They care about their country. And when it becomes apparent that their continued sacrifice serves no useful end, especially no useful end for Ukraine, the possibility of a coup rises up. So I'm not dismissing it altogether. I'm just saying that, it's a complicated situation, that you have to have certain factors fall in place, and they're not there yet. I still see a resilience in the Ukrainian army, a determination to try and win, regardless of how futile that seems. So I don't think they're at the point right yet where they're going to, we're going to have a replay of January, February 1917 on the line.
Some things are achieved, though. Zelensky's mother-in-law has just bought a £150 million mansion in Egypt. Who knew there's a whole colony of oligarchs with mansions on the seaside in Egypt? I hadn't thought of that. But this to be added to the property portfolio in Tel Aviv, in Paris, in London, in Florida. The Zelenskys, and one presumes the comprador, have enriched themselves vastly in the course of Zelensky's tenure. This must add insult to injury to the troops and to their families.
It should. And logically speaking, it must. But we have to remember that Ukraine is singularly the most corrupt place in Europe today, and it competes with the most corrupt place in the world today. Corruption is in the lifeblood of Ukraine. Ukraine can't exist without corruption. Everything about Ukraine is corrupt from the top to the bottom, and the people have become so inured to corruption that what should stand out is just egregious and damning and worthy of removal from office, or worse, simply disappears into the background. Zelensky having his mother buy a multi-million-dollar mansion in Egypt should stand out, except that every other general, every other politician's mother is buying a similar mansion elsewhere in the world. The elite of Ukraine have fled Ukraine. They will not suffer for Ukraine. They have stolen everything from Ukraine, all the aid that the British people provided, that the Americans provided through their governments, not that they directly provided it, but they had their taxes taken from them, packaged and sent to the most corrupt place on the planet, where 7 out of $10 that are sent to Ukraine don't make it to where they're supposed to go, but rather make it to the pockets of the corrupt oligarchs, corrupt businessmen, corrupt politicians, of Zelensky himself. This is the norm in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians aren't shocked by it the way you and I are, and what I hope the American people, the British people, the French people, and everybody else out there saying, why do we continue to support such a corrupt regime? That question must be asked, and answers must be demanded of our politicians.
Lastly, Scott, survey the battlefield for us now, will you? The Robotyno seems to be where the Ukrainians are making a significant push. Will they make any gains there? On the other hand, the Russian army is sweeping towards that town that just out of nowhere occurred to me so many months ago. I've maybe mentioned it on the show 100 times. It looks like the place that will next be captured, liberated by the Russian forces, Kupiansk. Are these the two most interesting parts of the front? Is it more or less stasis elsewhere, or is there fighting going on right along the line?
The fighting's going on right along the line. There's no, I mean, there's levels of intensity, but it's not like there's all is quiet on the front by Bakhmut, all is quiet on the front by Krasny Liman. No, there's constant fighting going back and forth. The thing is, on the majority of the front, you have an equilibrium where you have the Russians and the Ukrainians putting pressure on each other, and they're grinding each other like this, but there's a relative equilibrium. In places like Robotyno, which is going to be the alpha and the omega of this counteroffensive. It's where it began back in early June, where the 47th and 33rd Brigades, two of the elite brigades trained and equipped by the West, initiated the assault. And it's today where the 47th reconstituted and the 82nd Air Landing Brigade and several others have been thrown in for the final assault. This is where it ends. Understand that the 82nd and the two other brigades that constituted the Strategic Reserve are the last forces, last trained forces that Ukraine has. They have no other reserves. When these reserves die, and they are dying in huge numbers right now, there's nothing left. These were the exploitation forces. These were the forces that were to be committed to the battle once the first line of defense was pierced, once the second line of defense was pierced. They would come in and finish the breaching of the Russian defensive lines. The first line of defense has yet to be reached by Ukraine. They are dying in the village of Robotyno, in the fallow fields that surround Robotyno. They will not breach the first line of defense. They will not succeed. They will fail. But what they are doing is burning through precious human and material resources that could be used to plug the gaps elsewhere in the line, such as Kupiansk, where there are insufficient Ukrainian forces to deal with the Russians who are now pushing them. They will capture Kupiansk. They will threaten Kharkov. Ukraine will be compelled to take more troops away from those areas where you have an equilibrium, which now means you have an imbalance. And then the Russians will continue to push there. And eventually the Russians will push the Ukrainians back, compelling what I believe will be a precipitous retreat, the Dnieper River, which is the major geographical feature behind which Ukraine might have a chance of reestablishing a coherent defense. Their defenses right now are going to collapse in the coming weeks and months.